In 4 days, 1.4 billion people will be celebrating 75 years of India being an independent democracy. That doesn't even cover the number of people who no longer hold an Indian passport, but will be celebrating from all corners of the world. To paint a picture, the city of Mumbai in India is nearing 21 million people as its population. The country of Australia had an estimated population of 25.9 million people, according to the ABS, on 8 August 2022. Today's topic is an important one because India is a unique and real proof of concept of this political system. If democracy can work in a country like India, with its large population, low income levels, diversity in customs, color, cuisines, costumes, languages, ethnicity, and literacy levels, it can work anywhere in the world. 75 years may seem like a long journey for a country who had to rebuild itself from colonialization and partition. For a country who had to adopt and embed democratic culture in its social fabric. But it may also seem like mere pages in a really thick book tracing the long history of a civilization that has endured innumerable challenges and changes over time. Winston Churchill had predicted that India would fall into barbarism and the Middle Ages after the Britishers left. India did not. When India had its first elections, 85% of its voters were illiterate. The entire process for conducting elections had to be designed, taught, and implemented in a free, fair, and transparent manner. Some called it the biggest gamble in history, but India successfully elected its first government and practiced universal adult franchise. Aldous Huxley said India might become a military dictatorship after Nehru's death. India chose democracy and elected its next government. In 1967, a Times article remarked that soon India would vote in its fourth and last elections. India has successfully conducted 17 elections to date. In 2015, the Supreme Court of India protected freedom of expression of its citizens by striking down a prohibitory section of the Indian ID Act. 3 years later, the same court protected the right of equality by striking down Section 377A and decriminalizing private consensual same-sex activities among adults. Time and again, there have been questions about the fate of this democratic experiment in India. History shows us that India has always chosen democracy. The Economist Intelligence Unit classified India as a flawed democracy in 2021. In the same year, the Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar dismissed these reports and said, and I quote, "You use the dichotomy of democracy and autocracy. You want the truthful answer. It is hypocrisy. Because you have a set of self-appointed custodians of the world who find it very difficult to stomach that someone in India is not looking for their approval, is not willing to play the game they want it to be played. So they invent their rules, their parameters, they pass their judgments, and then make out as though this is some kind of a global exercise." Some people would agree with Mr. Jaishankar. Some, like the member of the opposition party, Shashi Tharoor, would argue that the ruling party, the BJP, is undermining what he calls civic nationalism and practicing what he calls ethnic nationalism. In his book, The Struggle for India's Soul, Mr. Tharoor outlines how 75 years ago, India chose to be a nation state that is not defined by religion, but by a constitution and rule of law. Mr. Tharoor blames the ruling party for creating an environment where one is now forced to question whether that decision is under threat of being reversed. The topic for today's discussion is thus a very pertinent one, and I welcome you to listen to the expert reflections of our esteemed speakers. We are joined by Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, former member of the Harvard government, and federal Liberal MP from 1994 to 2019. Mr. Abbott is one of the key architects of the free trade agreement that was signed between India and Australia earlier. Someone who is known for putting in a lot of hard work and faith into bringing the two countries together, closer to each other. Mr. Abbott will be sharing his experiences of the Indian democracy and participating in the interview with Salvatore Babones. Salvatore, as Tom mentioned, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Sydney and an incoming director of the China program at the CIS. He has also recently conducted an in-depth examination of the international rankings, like the Economist intelligence units, of the Indian democracy, and argued for celebrating the success of democracy in India. Now, before I go and welcome Mr. Abbott, I'd also like to wish everyone here a happy Raksha Bandhan. Mr. Abbott.
Well, thank you very much, Aarti. It's great to be here at the Centre for Independent Studies. It's great to see this wonderful think tank flourishing mightily under Tom's leadership, as it previously did for so many years under Greg Lindsay's leadership. And it's good to be here to talk tonight about Australia and India, about India's role in the world and India's contribution to the democratic world as not just the largest democracy in the world, but actually one of the oldest democracies in the world. It's often forgotten that back in 1947, when independent India emerged, there were actually probably only a dozen truly democratic countries. So India has been vibrantly democratic for longer than Germany. It's been vibrantly democratic for longer than Spain. It's been vibrantly democratic, arguably, for longer than France. So here's to India. Here's to India. Look, obviously I'm going to have a very thorough discussion with Salvatore, but I should just offer this little thought. When I was studying history at school, I took quite an interest in India, and maybe it was because as an Anglophile, I was interested in how Britain had gone in India. And look, we can go through a litany of errors and mistakes because it doesn't matter which country we're talking about, there are errors and mistakes. But at its best, British India was an attempt to bring the best of the West to an ancient and deep culture and civilization. And I'll always remember, I think it was Macaulay who said in the 1830s that Britain's role in India was to enable, quote, the native peoples to walk alone in the paths of justice. Now, maybe that was a paternalistic, patronising thing to say, but nevertheless, there was a wonderful liberal ideal there, enable the Indian people to walk alone in the paths of justice, and that's exactly what they've been doing magnificently for the last 75 years, and we celebrate on August the 15th, next Monday, the 75th anniversary of Indian independence and Indian democracy. I've been, as I said, interested in India since my teenage years. When I was going from Australia to Britain to take up a scholarship, I didn't want to fly over India without at least paying my respects. I thought it would be discourteous to fly over almost 1 billion people, as it then was, without at least touching down and paying my respects. So I spent about 3 months roaming around, sadly only northern India. I spent much of the time with the Australian Jesuit mission in Bihar province, but I did get a pretty good taste of India in that time. And I thought even then that India was going to be one of the most important countries in the world. I thought even then that India was a natural partner for Australia. And certainly by the time I became Prime Minister, I think I was more than justified in saying again and again and again that India was the world's emerging democratic superpower, and don't we need another democratic superpower? And India has just gone further ahead in the 7 years since I left office. Now, these are very challenging times, very, very challenging times. I don't think too many Australians have really woken up to just how challenging these times are. And I would recommend to anyone interested in geopolitics reading Jim Molan's book published just a week or so back, Danger on Our Doorstep. Very, very sober yet alarming assessment of just where we are in the Indo-Pacific right now. These are very challenging times. We're obviously paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Ukraine, but it's not just in Eastern Europe where dictators are on the march. Look at what is happening with China under the Communist Party, under the leadership of Xi Jinping. These dictatorships, these two dictatorships, are on the march, very much on the march, as we've seen with the belligerence associated with the Pelosi visit. But there are others as well. I don't think that we can assume that Iran is reconciled to peaceful coexistence with Israel and peaceful coexistence with its neighbours. I don't think we can assume that Turkey, for argument's sake, is a country that has nothing but benevolence towards its neighbours. So, in a way, almost unimaginable, just a few years back, these dictatorships are on the march. And under these circumstances, it's incredibly important that the democracies stand together. And this is where I believe the Quad is by far the most significant strategic development since the formation of NATO. There are two people in particular who deserve vast credit from the whole of mankind, certainly from the whole of democratic mankind for the Quad. First of all, the late great Shinzo Abe, who first talked about the Indo-Pacific and popularised the Indo-Pacific as a concept. And it was his trip to India and his statement, his speech to the Indian Parliament, which really gave initial birth to the Quad. Of course, the Quad then really fell into disrepair, as it were, when he left office and when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister here. But then when Shinzo Abe returned, he found a magnificent partner in Narendra Modi. Now, India is the key to the Quad. There's absolutely no doubt about that. India is the key. And to persuade India to drop its historical indifference, if you like, to the wider world, its non-alignment, to use the word which was so popular under Nehru and his successors, to engage much more actively with the wider world, and in particular to engage more actively with the wider world as, if you like, a partner of two Western countries, the United States and Australia, took enormous magnanimity on Modi's part. And this is why I think both Abe and Modi are rightly regarded as transformational leaders of their country. And certainly when I was PM, Abe and Modi were by far the most impressive world leaders I was lucky enough to meet. And thank God we've still got one of them at the head of his nation and still going strong. So the dictatorships are on the march in a way we have not seen since the 1930s and 40s. The democracies have got to stand together in a way that we wouldn't have expected to need to, at least since the 1980s. The Quad is vital, even though it is still relatively underdeveloped and needs to be dramatically further developed in the months and years ahead. But the Quad also, I don't believe that the Quad should be seen purely as a strategic partnership. It's important that it be an economic partnership as well. And this is where I was delighted to be able to help the Morrison government to finalise the trade deal with India shortly before the election was called. This is the first deal that India has done with any major economy in quite a long time, and it's the best deal that it's done with any major economy. And I just hope we here in Australia have the wit to take full advantage of it. I think it is every Australian business's duty right now to try to ensure that China has no place in critical supply chains. And I think it is the obligation of all serious Australian businesses to have a India strategy, just in the same way that 30 or 40 years ago they might have thought it important to have a China strategy. Now, I stress, as I always do, that my argument is not with the Chinese people. My argument is with the Chinese Communist Party. My argument is with the Beijing regime. And there's about 1 million Australians of Chinese background, all of whom are terrific citizens. And the last thing I would want is for any of them to feel in any way stigmatised just because the government of the country of their ancestry is being so difficult. But nevertheless, we just have to face the fact that the regime of Xi Jinping is utterly different from the regime under the inspiration of Deng Xiaoping, and all of the optimism that we had a couple of decades back, all of the high hopes we held for a steady convergence of countries like China with the liberal democracies have been utterly dashed and will remain dashed as long as Xi Jinping is in charge in Beijing and as long as the Communist Party is in charge of China. So, as I said, very, very challenging times, but what better times to appreciate the vigour and the vitality of Indian democracy and to nurture ever stronger relations between Australia and this country with which we are a natural partner.
Prime Minister Abbott.
Ex-Prime Minister Abbott.
You like to tell that story of jetting off to India in 1981, crossing the country. You ended up in Bihar, the poorest state in India. Now, 1981 poor is a whole different kind of poor from 2022 poor. When you returned to India to help negotiate the India-Australia, to give it its proper title, the India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, how did you see the differences in the country in that 40 years?
Very good question, Salvatore. And I spent 3 months in India back then, and then I didn't go back until I was Prime Minister in 2014. So there was a lot of water under the bridge in that time. Even in 1981, India was a vastly more sophisticated economy than most Australians would have credited. I can remember, for instance, I think on my first day in Bombay, as we then called it, I was on the bus or something, probably coming in from the airport to the city, and we were going past a nuclear power station. Now, to this day, Australia lacks nuclear power stations, unfortunately, but even then India had nuclear power stations in a sign of the sophistication of India even 40 years ago, the economic sophistication of India even 40 years ago. But the transformation has been massive, absolutely massive. The thing that really impressed me about the India that I came to since 2014 is the extraordinary explosion of sophisticated infrastructure. And this is why I think India is on the verge of an economic takeoff every bit as powerful as the Chinese economic takeoff in the 80s and 90s, because there is such a massive infrastructure growth going on there. I think there are something like 50 Indian cities that are currently building metro systems. Right. Now, that's how you go from, I guess, being a third world city to being at least a potential first world city if you've got a metro system.
Now, I have to ask you a bit of a long question. I'll ask your patience. In February, March 2002, intercommunal violence between Muslims and Hindus in the Indian state of Gujarat left more than 1,000 people dead, perhaps 100,000 people homeless. Obviously, we can't adjudicate those events today. But many people lay the blame for those events squarely on the shoulders of a recently elected chief minister of Gujarat, a relatively inexperienced local politician named Narendra Modi. A dozen years later, Mr. Modi rose to become Prime Minister of India. When that happened, many international organizations and many international leaders shunned him and did not want to have anything to do with his government. You were the Prime Minister of Australia, or you became Prime Minister of Australia soon after that, and you were the first international leader to make a state visit to India. Why did you take that trip?
Well, why wouldn't I take that trip? Because there was a new Prime Minister, a vigorous new Prime Minister in India, and I had always thought that the Australia-India relationship had been badly underdeveloped and neglected for far too long. I mean, Modi came here in 2014, but previously it was 27 years since there'd been an Indian Prime Ministerial visit. Now, I think Howard went at least, I think he might have gone twice to India in his time, and Gillard certainly went once to India in her time. But it was 27 years between the visit of Mr. Gandhi and the Modi visit, and I just thought that this was a relationship of such extraordinary potential. In fact, of all the trade deals that were done in the period of the former coalition government, the Indian one was by far the most important. I mean, the China one, the Japan one, the South Korea one that happened when I was PM were good, although we probably wouldn't have done the China one had we known how things were going to develop. They were very important at the time in their own way, but we were talking about well-developed economic relationships for which the deal was really the icing on the cake. The India relationship is hugely underdeveloped, and that's why this deal is by far the most, I think, momentous of all of the deals. Now, so if we go back to 2014 and the riots that you talk about, or the intercommunal violence that you talk about, one of the things about spending 3 months in India and reading the Indian newspapers every day is that you know that not unexpectedly, in a vast and at times rather turbulent society, you do get things that you don't expect in Australia. It's not absolutely unknown for the police to fire on demonstrations, because sometimes in India, demonstrations can become incredibly violent. It's certainly not unknown for the police to lathi charge demonstrations because, again, they can easily get very, very out of hand in ways that we find difficult to imagine here in Australia, or at least we did until we saw Victorian police fire tear gas
maybe
and
it
rubber
wasn't
bullets
that bad.
and people gathering, I thought, pretty peacefully around the Shrine of Remembrance
But you must
in
have
Melbourne.
consulted with peers around the world. What did Barack Obama tell you?
I didn't actually consult with Barack Obama, funnily enough. But to get back to the problems in 2002, it all began when there was an attack on a train carrying pilgrims returning from a Hindu festival, and from memory, something like 60 people were killed. Now, that's hardly something that would have been abetted and encouraged by a pro-Hindu government.
Well, I don't want to adjudicate the events. I want to get into your own thinking at the time.
But instinctively, something that starts that way is hardly something that can be initially blamed on a kind of pro-Hindu government, if I can characterise the Modi Gujarati administration in those terms. And look, it's quite possible that the policing could have been done better, that the military could have been called in earlier, quite possible. But But as we know from Indian history, intercommunal violence can arise. I mean, look at the things that happened at the time of partition. I mean, gruesome, absolutely gruesome. But we didn't blame Nehru for that. We didn't blame Gandhi for that. I mean, I think he was still alive at that time. That was, if anyone was to blame for that, I suppose it was the departing imperialists who, cut and ran, arguably, in the face of all that stuff. So I think it's a bit rich for people to hold Modi personally accountable for that violence. I dare say there were things that could have been better, but it was obviously a very difficult situation.
2 months after your state visit to India, Narendra Modi came to Australia to address a joint session of Parliament. Were your goals for that visit purely commercial, or did you also have political intentions?
Well, I was very, very keen to do what I could to revitalise the Quad, and I was obviously very, very keen to turbocharge the free trade talks. And Australia, from memory, in the last year of the Howard government, had been involved in the Malabar naval exercises, and I was very, very keen to get us involved again in the Malabar naval exercises and deepen our defence and security cooperation, as well as deepen the economic cooperation.
Now, for those of you who may not be aware, the political party that Narendra Modi leads, the Bharatiya Janata Party, Indian People's Party, is routinely described in the international press as a, quote, Hindu nationalist party. Now, nearly all political parties in India describe themselves as nationalist, including the Indian National Congress. There's nothing odd about that. But do you see the BJP as being a specifically Hindu party?
Well, can I suggest that part of the difficulty that superficial overseas observers have is that nationalism is a pejorative term in English-speaking countries, in most English-speaking countries, in most Western countries. Nationalism is pejorative. I mean, it was Dr. Johnson who said, I think patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Now, I don't think Dr. Johnson was really impugning patriotism. I think he was attacking the misuse of patriotism. I think he was really attacking what would now be described as nationalism. But nationalism is a slightly pejorative term in most Western countries. But I wouldn't see the BJP as being a nationalist in the Australian sense party. I would see the BJP as being a patriotic in the Australian sense party, and I don't see what's wrong with patriotism myself.
But you see this specifically Hindu, or is...
Well, let's continue. I'm not reading the Indian papers on a daily basis, so there might be lots of things that I miss. But while it's true that at the moment, I think, the BJP doesn't have any Muslim members of parliament in the federal parliament. As I understand it, something like 20% of Indian Muslims voted for the BJP. So if it really was sort of an anti-Muslim or a pro-Hindu party, that would probably not be the case. I think there's only one Christian member of the BJP in the federal parliament at the moment. So look, if I was offering sort of fraternal advice to the BJP, I'd probably say, just as the Liberal Party needs to get more women and all the rest of it into Parliament, maybe the BJP should get a few more Muslims and one or two Christians perhaps into Parliament. But I think it's a very long bow to say that it is anti everyone except Hindus. And it's a very long bow to accuse India as being a flawed democracy. There are two tests of a democracy. First of all, does it have free speech and in particular free media? And second, can you change the government? And India has a riotously free media, an absolutely riotously free media. and it's got a marvellous diversity of media. I mean, here in Australia, we can only envy the diversity of India's media and the exuberance of its free speech from all perspectives. And obviously, in India, no party has a monopoly on government. I mean, the BJP has a strong majority in the lower house. It lacks a majority in the upper house. And I think it has less than half of the provincial governments. So I think any suggestion that India is in some way a gravely imperfect democracy is it's A, it's false, and B, I think only people who are looking at India from afar through jaundiced eyes could come to that conclusion.
Well, let me continue to ask you, if you'll bear with me, on Hindu nationalism. You probably know Narendra Modi better than any other Australian politician. You're certainly aware that Narendra Modi is a lifelong member of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, the National Volunteer Organization. Few Australians have ever heard of the RSS, but every Indian in the audience knows the organization. The RSS has been very effective at combating caste distinctions in India. In fact, supporting Mr. Modi, the son of a lower caste Tiwala, to become chief minister and then prime minister of India. But the RSS and its affiliated political party, the BJP, are often accused of substituting religion for caste, that is, for defeating caste prejudice by inserting instead a pro-Hindu prejudice. Do you think that the RSS, and by extension the BJP, may be playing that role of exacerbating Hindu-Muslim tensions by promoting religion as an alternative to caste, religious unity being the solution to caste conflict?
Well, again, I don't read the Indian newspapers every day, and I don't follow these debates with kind of semiotic intensity. But the fact that something like 20% of Muslims voted for the BJP suggests that Indian Muslims do not in any uniform way regard the BJP as anti-Muslim. The fact that at different times the BJP has had Muslim members of parliament at state and federal level again suggests that it's at least open to other faiths. And look, it's very easy to smear a political party, and political parties are fair game in democracies because the whole system depends upon an organised opposition to a political party, and the organised opposition will usually come up with all sorts of criticisms, many of them not fair, and I suspect that this might be not a particularly fair one. But as I said, if I were offering fraternal advice, I would say that it would probably be good PR, if nothing else, to increase minority representation in the ranks, just as it would be pretty good PR for the Liberal Party to do the same thing. But is the Liberal Party anti-women? Of course not. I can remember years and years ago being rather sympathetic with a party called the DLP, which was supposed to be a Catholic party, but actually I think 2 of its 4 senators were not. So, there we are.
All right. Well, women in the audience, Tony's recruiting. Prime Minister Abbott, in one of your many post-political roles, you serve as chairman of the board of Quadrant magazine. As you know, I've recently published an article in Quadrant reviewing the international evaluations of Indian democracy, which are quite dire. The Economist intelligence unit now labels India a, quote, flawed democracy, characterized by, quote, a serious deterioration in the quality of democracy under leader Narendra Modi. The Varieties of Democracy Institute, based in Sweden, goes even further, claiming that India is no longer a democracy at all, but is now an electoral autocracy on a par with Russia. How much credit, I know the answer is little, well, let me ask, why do you give so little credit to these international, accredited, credentialed, highly respected evaluations?
I think it's very easy for these organisations to succumb to a form of prejudice. And I suspect that the problem with the Modi government is this use of the term nationalist and this association with religion. But just because these organisations have a particular prejudice, I think we should be careful about accepting at face value their judgments, given I think the bias that they I think potentially suffer from. I mean, look, I'm not saying Donald Trump was the world's greatest president, and I'm not saying that Donald Trump was the world's greatest human being, but Trump is not as bad as the liberal media in the United States universally portrays him to be. Our friend, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is not nearly as bad as he is universally portrayed to be. In fact, I think he's actually a pretty good Prime Minister, even if he could have been a bit stronger on the Ukrainian issue. And I just think we should be very careful about accepting at face value the judgments of organisations which are completely consumed with Western liberal bias.
You know, we can edit out a clip there of you saying Donald Trump was the world's greatest human being and publish that online, and we'd be entirely entitled because you did say that. One challenge in India, and maybe it's a challenge that any prime minister would love to have, is that the opposition to the BJP is weak and fractured. Obviously, we can't blame Narendra Modi for the failures of the Congress party to oppose him. But can it cause problems for democracy when one party is simply too successful?
Well, again, I think you're drawing a long, people would be drawing a long bow.
Don't mention long bows. We just watched RRR this week, and we've had enough of long bows. I don't know if you've seen the movie.
No, I haven't.
Get it on Netflix. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's an overstatement to say that the BJP is too dominant, given that it doesn't actually control both houses of the federal parliament, and it's not in office in 50% plus of the Indian states. So yes, it's in a stronger position than the Congress has ever been in recent times. But I think to say that it's completely dominant is not right. It's just not right. Now, as a footballer, rugby player, I didn't mind winning 50-0. I loved winning 50-0. It may not have been a great spectacle for the spectators, but nevertheless, you never want the opposition to be too strong because you want to win. So I mean, arguably it is better for democracy if the opposition is strong. It's almost a truism that strong oppositions make for better government. And look, the electoral cycle inevitably will mean that at some point in time, either the Congress revives or some alternative to the Congress emerges, and the current dominance of the BJP is challenged.
Now, you've long had a strong and productive relationship with Prime Minister Modi. It's clear you have a lot of respect for him. What do you think will happen after Modi? No one stays in office forever.
If Freedom House are right, he will stay in office, at least for the term of his natural life, because he's a Putin-like figure.
What do you think is the long-term prognosis for Indian democracy?
Well, Modi may well be there for another few years. He's, in his late 60s, so there's no reason why he couldn't be there for another few years. India's certainly had some quite elderly prime ministers. I think Morarji Desai was 84 when he took office and something like 87 when he left office. Prime Minister Singh was, I think, close to 80 when he left office. So it wouldn't be inconceivable for Modi to stay there for maybe another decade. So after Modi might not be for 5 or 10 years. But if you look at the BJP, I had a lot to do with Piyush Goyal, who's their leader in the upper house. Very, very impressive man, a really impressive man. And I reckon that if Piyush Goyal were to, the BJP could do a lot worse, I would have thought. I mean, if Piyush Goyal was the Indian Prime Minister, I think India would be extremely well represented by comparison to many other global leaders. So I can see at least one other person in the BJP who would be a creditable global leader.
We started a bit late tonight, so I'd like to shift straight to my final question, and we'll leave some time for the audience to ask questions. I know many of you want to. A few months ago, speaking at the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi, you said, quote, "If there is to be a leader of the free world in 50 or 100 years' time, frankly, it's much more likely to be India than the United States." Both as a scholar and as an American, I'd like to ask you...
You're an Australian now,
Oh, I'm not an Australian. I only live here. I'd like to ask you, were you just being polite to your hosts in Delhi, or did you really mean that?
Look, I really do mean it, because India will soon be the world's most populous nation, and even if GDP per head in India is, for argument's sake, a third of what it is in the United States, that will still make India a larger economy than the United States. And I don't think it's at all unreasonable to think that sometime within the next few decades, Indian GDP per head could be a third that of the United States. For instance, Chinese GDP per head is right now something like 1/5 of the United States, and India has the advantage of democracy, the rule of law, and as much market capitalism as anyone does have these days. So I would be amazed if in 30 or 40 years' time, India isn't at least as significant an economy as China. And I think that if that's the case, given its numbers, yeah, sure, it'll be as strong as the United States economically. And if you're as strong economically, sooner or later, you're going to be as strong strategically.
Granting the power, is India politically disposed to take a leadership role in the world stage when its history has been one of non-alignment?
Its history has been one of not wanting to interfere with its neighbours other than when absolutely necessary to safeguard its own citizens, and in the case of West Pakistan, prevent a genocide that was taking place not at the hands of Hindus but at the hands of East Pakistan, West Pakistan. So look, India's record is a pretty good one. I don't think any of India's neighbours, other than Pakistan, which is in a special case, could really put their hand on their heart and accuse India of being a bully, even though India is so much bigger than all of them. That certainly isn't the case with China. So what do you need to be a global leader? You need economic and military strength, but you also need, if you like, benevolence. And the reason why Britain and then America have been relatively benign superpowers is because there was this combination of strength with benevolence. And I think that India, of the emerging superpowers, there's only one that has benevolence, and that's certainly not the one based in Beijing.
Prime Minister Abbott, thank you very much for talking to us tonight. And we do have time for some questions.
My name is Irfan Malik. I'm the president of Australia-India Business Council here. Come from India, been Australian for 20 years, come from the state of Kerala, which again, interestingly, is the only state ruled by a communist party, which is a very inclusive communist party, and very multicultural, strong, interfaith relationship, and where we keep the religion at home or within yourself. It's more about community and collaborative culture. And that's what I've taken through here to Australia, and I strongly believe in the Australian multicultural fabric as well. What I feel, again, coming from a business background, in living and breathing in the startup innovation space, and that's the India I connect with, the new India, which is driven by social innovation, sustainable entrepreneurship, the new India narrative, which is what we want to really harp on. Of course, there are political challenges any country would have, but beyond that, the narrative is about how we can build this global trade play. And not only our collaboration, Australia, now at India at 75, but looking at India at 700 or India at 100 in the next 25 years, that's going to be a game changer. And how can we shift that narrative from this political discussion to more around trade, the better for the global play is what I would love to see. And what are your thoughts on how we can shape that from Australia?
Well, the point I made in my opening remarks, I think every Australian business of significance needs to have an India strategy. And I certainly think that it would be good for Australians that have got good connections back to India to encourage Indian businesses to do likewise. In the end, the discussion will follow the facts, as it were, and if the relationship with India for most people is largely determined by what they read in the left liberal press, yes, there might be an obsession with the BJP allegedly being a Hindu nationalist party and therefore not good. If, on the other hand, the relationship or the attitude to India is predominantly a function of the Australian of Indian background who's your neighbour or your employer or your best mate, or a function of the fact that you're driving an Indian-made car or your business has got India in its supply chains, well, then it's a very different kind of conversation. So, but again, it's really up to all of us as individuals to make the conversation, and the global conversation will be the sum of all those individual conversations.
Now let's have short questions. Can we go to Qinjin, who's the president of the Federation for Democratic China, and we'll go back and forth sides of the room. We'll do our best. Short questions, please.
Your Honorable Tony Abbott. Thank you very much to see you here. My question is very simple. How do you think Australia should play a role to demonstrate her obligation for peace and security and stability to the region and the world?
Well, thank you, Xinjiang.
And we'll go to the other side.
You know, I stress that it's incredibly important that Australia doesn't do anything that, well, we've got to be very careful not to do anything that calls into question the Australianness and the Australian patriotism of the million-plus Australians of Chinese background. And the Australian Chinese community, as we know, has been here for over 150 years, and Senator Thomas Backup was in the Federation Parliament, and Trooper Yin Gan was one of the first ashore at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. So there are a lot of wonderful Australians of Chinese background, and we just have to keep stressing that over and over and over again. That said, you know, I think the Beijing government is an extraordinary difficulty at the moment, and I think that what we need to do here in Australia is deepen our alliances, and the Quad and AUKUS are obviously an important part of that. I think we need to strengthen our military capability, and the Morrison government was doing its best, not nearly quickly enough, but it was doing its best. Hopefully the new government will be quicker at actually giving us the capabilities that we need. I also think we need to develop national resilience. Now, look at the Ukrainians. We all thought that Ukraine was riddled from top to bottom with Russian sympathisers who would welcome Putin with open arms. That's not how it's turned out at all. I mean, the Ukrainians have shown, whether they're Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking, the Ukrainians have shown almost to the last man and woman an extraordinary passion for their freedom and independence. And I think that we need to, in a sense, look at that and try to be a little bit more that way ourselves, frankly. One of the real problems we've got in Australia at the moment is this epic cultural self-doubt. I mean, all of these people who should know better and who should certainly be more conscious of their duty as people who helped to shape Australia. All of these people who think that Anzac Day is a contested idea. There were at least 5,000 Indian soldiers that went ashore as part of the Gallipoli campaign, and it seems that the Australians and the Indians were great friends on Gallipoli. This whole Invasion Day narrative is so profoundly wrong, and yet it's so pervasive at present. So, as well as doing the obvious things in terms of strengthening our economy vis-a-vis its current overdependence on China, strengthening our military vis-a-vis our current almost total reliance on the United States, and strengthening partnerships beyond the US alliance, I do think that we've got a big job to do in terms of our own national self-confidence.
Here in the blue?
My name is Amit Nanlaskar. I'm part of the executive leadership at the Australia-India Business Trade Foundation. Tony, lovely to have you here today. Just a quick question. What role do you see India playing or the dependence on India for a country like ours or USA in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, obviously, India is now most years is now the largest source of migrants to Australia. So over time, the percentage of the Australian population with links to India will grow. I think that there's only one way for Australia-Indian trade, and that's up, and potentially it could be quite spectacularly up, because India has the ability to manufacture at scale at good price and quality, and therefore substitute for China in those respects. So I think economically there's a huge role for India, but also as its economic strength grows and its self-confidence develops and its willingness to act as a global leader as opposed to a regional leader grows, well, I think the sky's the limit. And that's why I say that if there is a leader of the free world in 50 years' time, it's at least as likely to be the Prime Minister of India as the President of the United States.
Please, we have a question at the back. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ash Golkar, and I'm from the Australian South Asia Forum. Throughout this evening, we have heard the word democracy many times, the word democracy. The question is, are we looking at democracy and what it entails from a different perspective? Before the British came into India, India actually contributed about 1/3 of the world GDP. And that was without democracy, or that was with democracy as it was understood then, which is through monarchs and so on. So the question is that right now, if we look at any developing country and we are talking about looking at it from a democratic perspective, it's almost saying that, a nation is a company. We are more focused on equity within the company with regards to its management, but we are not really focused on KPIs. Shouldn't the focus be on the KPIs for a nation with regards to equity, social equity, and so on, rather than a notion of democracy as is currently understood by the Western world?
Look, that's a fair point, and England was a liberal society long before it was a democratic polity. And if you've got to choose between everyone voting routinely for the leaders of the country on the one hand, and the rule of law and freedom of speech, etc., on the other, I'd probably say you've got to go for that first, because it's only once that is established that a democracy is likely to be successful. But I don't think that it is an either-or choice. And India has managed to maintain its democracy throughout fairly tumultuous times and at the same time improve the lot of its citizens. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that the lot of the average Indian economically is vastly better today than even 20 years ago, let alone 50 or 70 years ago. And while you can certainly look at a place like Singapore, for instance, and say, well, okay, that's not really a full democracy, you can now look at a place like Taiwan, which is a full democracy and has had changes of government both ways, and it is incredibly prosperous. And one of the reasons why the Beijing regime is so neuralgic about Taiwan is because Taiwan is living, breathing proof that there is no totalitarian gene inside the Chinese DNA. So I wouldn't say that the focus has got to be on economic development versus democracy. I would certainly accept that a lasting democracy and a full democracy requires the rule of law, freedom of speech, and respect for fundamental rights. But I don't think economic development and democracy are in any way necessarily at odds.
All right. Can we try to squeeze in 3 lightning questions and 3 thunder answers? Can we start right in the front here?
Yeah.
Go to the press afterwards, and then if we can end with Pranav.
Thank you. Just really quickly, I'm Michael DePercy, University of Canberra. The parallels between the 1930s and now geopolitically, Australia's shift from Britain to the United States in our strategic thinking, it would seem that it wouldn't be as easy to transition to thinking of India in the same way we do in the
Australia
US.
looks to India,
Immediately.
free of any inhibitions because of our traditional relationship with the United States.
Well, I'm not so much that, but I'm just wondering to what extent are we capable in Australia of making that transition in the future?
Could you pass it just there?
Good question. Well, I think I'm not saying that we should sunder the US alliance. I just think the reality is that, at least relatively, America's power is waning and its will is weakening. And that's why it's important for other countries to step up.
Pawan Luthra?
Pawan Luthra, Indian Link Media Group. Mr. Abbott, your thoughts on India's stand in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is quite similar to what China's stand is in the same conflict.
And be careful, this is the press.
Yeah, okay.
All
Look,
right.
I don't
Can we go
think
to China?
it's correct that India's stand is comparable to China's. I mean, China has signed a no limits partnership with Russia. India has done no such thing. Yes, historically, India has been close to the old Soviet Union, i.e. Russia, and India still relies on Russia to supply some parts to its military, although this is changing dramatically. When I was at the Rosina Dialogue recently, to a man and a woman, the Indian participants would say confidentially, look, of course we know what Russia has done is an absolute abomination, but for reasons of realpolitik, we have to be a little bit careful about what we publicly say. Now, Israel is in exactly the same position, but no one would accuse Israel of being anti-democratic or non-democratic or in some way.
Well, some would.
Well,
Some do.
okay. Good point. Well, I hope no one in this room would.
I don't. Could we end with, so there is a background to this event. This is being co-sponsored by the Australia-India Business and Trade Foundation, and this event arose through my relationship with Pranav. So I have to ask Pranav to give us the final question. Make it a good one.
So my question, Honorable Prime Minister, is, you talk often about the Quad, and clearly the Quad is a force of growth defending liberty and freedom. If you could tell Washington one thing, what would it be to kind of have India fairly and squarely in the house of Quad and not try to swim in two boats with Russia because, historically we get our arms from Russia? What would be the one thing that Washington, if you could tell them?
Well, obviously sell military hardware to India on the same basis that you sell military hardware to other close partners. I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is just remember that you've got to take other people seriously. And I think that there has been a tendency by the Americans, God bless them, I am a huge fan of America and Americans, but
Thank you.
but American officialdom can be bloody arrogant, and I think it's important that it try to wind all that back, particularly in its dealings with India, because Indians, can understandably enough be a little bit tetchy about some of this stuff, and I think allowances have got to be made for that.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.